They called it a lumbering giant. To Japanese pilots trained in the art of maneuver, speed, and precision, the American B-17 Flying Fortress seemed like a ridiculous creation. Before the war, reports of its size and defensive armament were dismissed in Tokyo with laughter. How could something so large, so heavy, and so slow survive in combat against nimble fighters like the Zero? The very name, Flying Fortress, struck many as American bravado, proof that the enemy trusted more in machinery than in skill. Pilots joked that the B-17 would be a floating target, a whale in a sea of sharks, but by the time the Pacific War entered its second year, the laughter had died away. Those same pilots who once mocked the fortress were forced to watch their bases crumble under its bombs. The B-17 was a paradox. It was not the fastest bomber, nor the most advanced in design. What made it legendary was a combination of range, firepower, and resilience. Its frame could absorb terrible punishment and still return home. Its wings carried thousands of pounds of bombs deep into enemy territory, and its fuselage bristled with machine guns that spat fire in every direction. Japanese pilots who approached too confidently often discovered the hard way that attacking a fortress was no easy feat. A single aircraft could unleash streams of .50 caliber bullets that shredded wings and cockpits. A formation of them created a storm of lead through which few attackers emerged unscathed. In the early months of the Pacific conflict, Japanese superiority seemed unquestionable. Their fighters swept across the skies, their bombers reduced Allied bases to rubble, and their pilots basked in the aura of invincibility. They saw themselves as heirs of the samurai tradition, warriors of the air who relied on discipline, precision, and daring. Against them, the Americans appeared clumsy and inexperienced. The B-17s that trickled into the theater seemed hopelessly outmatched. But beneath the surface, the tide was already shifting. The Flying Fortress was not just an airplane. It was a symbol of America's industrial and logistical power. Every month, more of them arrived, and every month, their presence expanded. Japanese commanders at first dismissed the B-17's role. They were convinced it could not carry enough bombs to matter, nor penetrate deep enough to strike meaningful targets. Yet the raids began, modest at first, then growing in intensity. Airfields in Rabaul, bases across the Solomons, and supply hubs in New Guinea felt the rumble of fortress bombardments. To the pilots stationed there, the message was clear. These machines they had mocked were not so easily destroyed. Instead of floating targets, they were floating hammers, pounding again and again until the rhythm of destruction broke morale. What unsettled Japanese pilots most was not a single raid, but the persistence. They might shoot down a fortress one day, only to see another formation overhead the next. They might cripple a bomber with cannon fire, only to watch it limp home and reappear weeks later repaired and ready. Unlike Japan, which struggled to replace losses, America's factories churned out B-17s in endless streams. Every destroyed bomber was replaced many times over. Every damaged bomber was repaired with spare parts that seemed inexhaustible. For pilots accustomed to scarcity, this abundance was unnerving. It meant that no matter how hard they fought, the enemy's strength would not diminish. The defensive firepower of the fortress also forced Japanese pilots to rethink their tactics. Early attacks came head-on or from the rear, where fighters could pour cannon shells into engines or tail sections. But the overlapping arcs of American machine guns turned these approaches into death traps. Many Zero pilots never returned from such encounters, their planes shredded before they could even line up a proper shot. The fortress demanded sacrifice from those who dared to challenge it, and over time, fewer pilots volunteered for the task. To dive into the storm of bullets was to risk everything for little reward. Pilots began to whisper about the B-17's resilience. Stories spread of bombers returning to base riddled with holes, engines smoking, tails half destroyed, yet somehow still in the air. Mechanics photographed aircraft that looked like they should have fallen apart long before reaching safety. These images circulated widely, reinforcing the sense that the fortress lived up to its name. For Japanese aviators trained to believe in the fragility of machines and the supremacy of human skill, this resilience was maddening. No matter how hard they struck, the fortresses refused to fall in numbers sufficient to halt the bombing campaign. As the war expanded, so did the B-17's role. While the later B-29 superfortress would eventually dominate the skies over Japan itself, the flying fortress left its mark on the islands and bases that supported the Japanese war effort. It was the anvil upon which the Allies hammered supply chains, airfields, and staging grounds. Japanese pilots, once so confident, now flew under the shadow of its wings, never knowing when the next formation would appear. They had mocked the idea of an aerial fortress, but their laughter turned to silence as their bases lay smoking in ruin. In the end, the flying fortress was more than an aircraft. It was a lesson. It taught the Japanese that war could not be won by skill alone, that courage and discipline were meaningless without the industrial machine to sustain them. The B-17 represented a nation that could build endlessly, fly endlessly, and bomb endlessly, and when the bases fell silent and the laughter stopped, the Japanese pilots realized too late that the whale in the sky was not prey, but predator. In the early Pacific battles, Japanese flyers scoffed when they heard the distant drone of heavy engines. They believed speed and agility always triumphed. Their training had drilled into them that the Zero, with its razor turns and deadly cannons, could dismantle any slow-moving enemy. At first glance, the B-17 seemed to confirm their belief. It was massive, ponderous, and visibly slower than the fighters that swarmed it. Yet as the first dogfights unfolded, something strange happened. Pilots who dived eagerly at the fortresses did not always return. Instead of easy kills, they encountered formations that filled the sky with gunfire. The very bulk they had mocked became a shield of steel and bullets. The fortress carried a crew of 10, each man trained for a specialized role. There was a bombardier, navigator, radio operator, and gunners stationed in nearly every direction. Nose, tail, waist, top turret, all bristled with heavy B-50 caliber machine guns. Japanese pilots accustomed to attacking defenseless bombers now faced a gauntlet of fire. Every approach carried mortal risk. Attack from the front, and you met the nose guns. Swing from the rear and the tail guns spat death. Dive from above, and the top turret tracked you relentless. Alone, a Zero could shred most opponents, but against a full squadron of B-17s the odds tilted sharply. One Japanese ace described his shock after making a head-on pass at a fortress. He expected to fire with impunity, but the sky erupted with bullets. His windshield shattered, his engine sputtered, and he barely managed to crash land back at base. Others were not so lucky. Accounts circulated of Zeros exploding mid-air under streams of American gunfire, their delicate frames torn apart in seconds. The fortress was not indestructible, but it punished arrogance brutally. Pilots who underestimated it often paid with their lives. The Japanese high command began to take notice. Reports of losses against the flying fortress contradicted their earlier dismissal. At first they insisted these were isolated incidents. Yet as more pilots failed to return, the pattern became undeniable. Bases across the Pacific were being struck repeatedly, often with devastating precision. The bombs dropped by B-17s cratered runways, destroyed hangars and disrupted fuel supplies. Worse still, these raids struck at the very infrastructure Japan needed to sustain its expansion. The laughter that once greeted the fortress's name had vanished. For the Japanese, the humiliation was profound. They had built their doctrine on the idea of the warrior spirit overcoming material disadvantage. Pilots were told their courage made them invincible, yet courage could not silence the drone of bombers overhead. The fortresses flew too high for anti-aircraft guns to reach with accuracy, too heavily armed for casual attacks, and too persistent to be deterred. Even when one was destroyed, another arrived days later. To the Japanese pilots, it seemed endless, a relentless tide of steel descending from the sky. The cultural clash was stark. Japanese flyers believed in personal glory. Victories were counted in kills, duels, and individual acts of daring. The Americans fought different. The fortress was a weapon of collective power. Its strength lay not in a single plane but in formations of many, overlapping arcs of defense, protecting one another. This philosophy baffled Japanese pilots at first. They sought to pick apart individuals, only to find themselves swallowed by the fire of the group. It was a different kind of warfare, one rooted not in individual valor but in industrial unity. Mechanics at Japanese bases, saw firsthand the destruction the B-17 unleashed. Runways once smooth were scarred with massive craters. Aircraft lined neatly in rows were reduced to twisted wreckage in seconds. Fuel depots erupted into infernos that burned for days. The fortress did not simply attack soldiers, it dismantled the very foundations of military power. Each raid crippled Japan's ability to replace its losses, and each loss made it harder to resist the next raid. Slowly, the war of attrition turned against them. Perhaps the most crushing blow was psychological. The Japanese had begun the war with near total confidence. They believed they could outfly, outfight, and outlast any enemy. But as the B-17s flattened base after base, that confidence frayed. Pilots who once mocked the fortress now spoke of it with respect, even fear. It was not fear of a single encounter, but of inevitability. They could no longer deny that the Americans had built a machine designed to endure, to punish, and to return again and again. Stories of miraculous returns only added to the mystique. Fortresses riddled with holes, engines on fire, even tails nearly severed, somehow limped back to friendly airfields. Photographs of battered bombers circulated widely, proof that the flying fortress lived up to its name. To Japanese pilots who knew how fragile their own aircraft were, these images were unsettling. If such machines could take that kind of punishment and still fly, what chance did they have to stop them? Courage alone could not change physics, nor could skill alter the reality of America's production lines. By late 1942 and into 1943, the joke was over. The B-17 was no longer dismissed but dreaded. Every distant rumble of engines sent pilots scrambling, not with laughter but with grim determination. They knew what was coming: the bombardment of their bases, the destruction of their lifelines, and the endless storm of steel that never seemed to stop. The fortress had proven itself not a whale for the harpoon but a predator in its own right, and Japanese pilots could only brace themselves as the shadow of inevitability spread across the Pacific sky. The Japanese had begun the Pacific War by striking with precision and audacity. From Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, their doctrine celebrated surprise and speed, relying on the belief that American industry was too slow, too clumsy, too indulgent to recover. Yet as 1942 gave way to 1943, their assumptions collided with the reality of the flying fortress. The B-17s were not fragile toys of an industrial giant. They were the cutting edge of a machine that had been underestimated. When those bombers appeared over Japanese-held bases, the thunder of their bombs was more than physical destruction. It was a message. The United States would not be beaten by daring strikes. It would answer with persistent scale and steel. To pilots stationed at Rabaul or New Guinea, the raids became a kind of nightmare rhythm. At first, they tried to treat them as opportunities, chances to prove their skill against a slow, overstuffed enemy plane. But the reality of combat turned those opportunities into costly traps. They would scramble, climb into the sun, and dive upon the formations, only to be greeted by the storm of 50 caliber bullets. Even the most skilled pilots found their Zeros riddled with holes, fuel tanks exploding, wings shredded before they could close in for a kill. The math was simple but brutal. Each fortress carried 10 men, nearly all armed with heavy machine guns. A formation of a dozen B-17s created over 100 streams of fire, saturating the sky with death. And yet even when one fortress fell, the rest continued on their mission. Bases still burned, runways still cratered, and hangars still collapsed in clouds of smoke. The Japanese pilots could claim victories, but they were hollow ones. For every bomber downed, more arrived in the following raids. It was attrition at its most merciless. Japan could not replace pilots as quickly as America replaced bombers. Each loss in the air was permanent, irreplaceable. Each destroyed B-17 was merely another number, subtracted from an endless sum. The contrast between the two nations became clearer with every raid. In Japan, resources grew scarcer. Fuel shortages forced pilots to ration flying hours. Maintenance crews lacked spare parts, often cannibalizing one plane to keep another flying. By comparison, Americans treated machines like tools in endless supply. Fortresses were repaired, replaced, and launched again with barely a pause. German soldiers later said the Jeep represented America's industrial strength on the ground. For Japanese pilots, the B-17 represented that same unstoppable force in the sky. The raids also carried a psychological message. beyond the battlefield. Japanese pilots had been trained to believe in the supremacy of the warrior spirit, that courage, skill and discipline outweighed mere material strength. But the fortress defied that belief. Here was a machine that reduced courage to ashes. A single zero, no matter how bravely flown, could not fight against a formation of fortresses, protected by interlocking guns. Individual valor meant little when the enemy's weapon was designed to endure. The lesson was bitter. In modern war, spirit without supply was suicide. As bases across the Pacific suffered under these raids, Japanese commanders began to shift tactics. They ordered coordinated group attacks on fortress formations, hoping massed fighters could overwhelm their defenses. But these efforts carried heavy costs. To close in required flying through walls of bullets. For every bomber damaged, multiple zeros were destroyed. The imbalance grew intolerable. Pilots who had once mocked the B-17 now dreaded being assigned to intercept it. Their bravado had curdled into fear. Stories circulated among the Japanese about the almost supernatural resilience of the flying fortress. Crews returned to their bases reporting impossible sights. Bombers flying with one engine aflame, tails half shot away, wings riddled with holes large enough to crawl through. They told of planes that should have been wreckage tumbling into the sea, yet somehow managed to limp back into the sky, turn and vanish over the horizon. These stories, repeated often, fed the sense that the fortress was less a machine than a phantom. How could something so badly damaged still fly? The answer was American engineering, but in the minds of its enemies it became something darker. Inevitability embodied in metal. The effect on morale was devastating. A fighter squadron could down a handful of bombers and still fail to prevent their bases from being flattened. Each victory felt like sand slipping through their fingers. They began to understand that the fortress was not a single opponent to be defeated, but a machine of attrition. It did not need to win every battle. It only needed to keep coming. And it kept coming. The Japanese Empire, stretched thin across a vast ocean, could not withstand such persistence. The fortress was the hammer that struck again and again, until cracks widened into collapse. And yet the B-17 was not merely a destroyer of bases. It was also a symbol of hope for the Americans. Its raids reassured beleaguered soldiers in the Philippines and on scattered islands that their nation was striking back. To the Japanese, this hope was poison. It proved the Americans were not cowed by Pearl Harbor or early defeats. They had been mocked for weakness, but now they were laughing no longer. Their laughter had been replaced by engines, by bombs, by fire raining down on the very bases from which Japanese pilots once boasted of their dominance. In this transformation, the flying fortress achieved something remarkable. It turned mockery into fear, superiority into doubt, and invincibility into vulnerability. For Japanese pilots, the lesson was harsh and inescapable. What they had dismissed as folly became the force that shattered their confidence and scarred their skies. Japanese air strategy had been built upon the assumption that their fighters would always dominate the skies. Their Zero was unmatched in maneuverability, their pilots highly trained, and their doctrine rooted in the belief that skill could overcome any technical disadvantage. But the B-17 challenged every one of those assumptions. It was not sleek, it was not graceful, and it did not duel in the traditional sense. It lumbered forward with purpose, seemingly oblivious to the dangers around it, daring anyone to try and stop it. And when Japanese pilots tried, they found themselves shredded by defensive fire, or humiliated by the sight of a bomber returning to base despite catastrophic damage. What made the fortress so dangerous was not just its armament but its philosophy. The Americans had designed it around the idea of collective survival. Each bomber was strong, but together they were nearly impenetrable. Japanese pilots who attacked lone bombers might succeed, but against tight formations the overlapping arcs of machine guns created a deadly zone of fire. It was not one plane protecting itself. It was many planes protecting each other. The Japanese, with their focus on individual prowess, had no true counter to this. Every attack became a gamble with death. The raids grew heavier as American production ramped up. Bases that once believed themselves safe found B-17s appearing overhead in increasing numbers. Airfields in Rabaul, Truk and New Guinea were repeatedly hammered, their runways torn apart, their planes destroyed on the ground. Pilots scrambled to intercept, but the fortresses flew at altitudes that pushed the limits of their fighters. Even when they reached them, the cost of engagement was high. The Japanese lost men they could not replace, while the Americans lost machines they could replace endlessly. Each clash widened the gap between the two air forces. For the men on the ground,
The psychological toll was immense. Mechanics worked desperately to repair aircraft only to see them destroyed hours later. Soldiers dug shelters and trenches, but bombs cratered them again and again. The sound of engines overhead became a source of dread, a constant reminder that their bases were never truly safe. And because the fortresses could strike deep behind the front lines, no airfield, no depot, no port felt secure. The Japanese Empire, which had expanded with such confidence, now found itself under siege from above. Even more galling was the contrast between the two nations' capacity for loss. Japanese bases often celebrated when a bomber was shot down, parading wreckage as proof that the flying fortress could be beaten. But these celebrations were hollow. Within days, new bombers appeared, flying the same missions, dropping the same bomb. Each destroyed fortress was a temporary reprieve, nothing more. For Japan, every lost fighter or pilot was irreplaceable. The imbalance was devastating. One side could bleed endlessly, the other could not afford even minor cuts. The cultural clash deepened the wound. Japanese flyers had been taught to revere sacrifice. They were prepared to die in combat, to give their lives for honor. But the B-17s revealed a different way of waging war. American crews fought not for glorious death, but for survival. They built machines that could take punishment and still fly home because to them, every life mattered. Japanese pilots could not reconcile this philosophy. It was alien to their culture of fatalism, and it gnawed at their confidence. How could they defeat an enemy who fought with such pragmatism, who refused to waste lives unnecessarily, and who had the resources to back that philosophy with action? Stories of fortress resilience spread like wildfire. Pilots described bombers trailing smoke, leaking fuel, and riddled with holes, yet somehow continuing their mission. Others recalled seeing B-17s limping back to friendly bases, their crews bloodied but alive. These tales were repeated again and again, building an aura of invincibility around the aircraft. For Japanese soldiers on the ground, the myth became as powerful as the reality. When they heard the engines, they assumed destruction was inevitable, whether or not their fighters rose to meet it.
By 1943, the fortress was more than a bomber. It was a psychological weapon. It shattered not only runways and hangars, but also confidence. Japanese commanders tried to rally their men, insisting the bombers could be stopped with discipline and courage. Yet their words rang hollow against the evidence. Bases flattened, supply lines cut, morale sinking. The fortress kept proving itself in ways speeches could not counter. It was not glamorous, but it was relentless, and relentlessness won wars. For the Americans, the B-17 became a symbol of their ability to strike back after Pearl Harbor. Each raid carried not just bombs, but vengeance, reassurance, and the promise of eventual victory. For the Japanese, it carried despair. The joke they had once made, that the fortress was a whale too slow for the sharks, had become bitter irony. It was the sharks who bled now, while the whale swam on unstoppable. As the month passed, the flying fortress became a constant shadow over Japanese operations in the Pacific. Every pilot knew its silhouette, every soldier recognized the hum of its engines, and every mechanic dreaded the destruction it could bring to their airfields. What once had been dismissed as a slow, clumsy bomber had now become the terror of the sky. By 1943, the very sight of a B-17 formation sent waves of tension rippling across Japanese bases. Men scrambled not with laughter but with urgency, desperate to defend against the storm that always followed. The fortress's raids were not random. They were deliberate, systematic, and devastatingly effective. Runways were prime targets, ensuring that Japanese aircraft could not even take off to fight. Maintenance hangars were obliterated, leaving grounded planes exposed to the elements and useless. Fuel depots, once carefully hidden, were found and ignited in massive explosions that burned for days. Each strike was a blow not just to infrastructure but to the rhythm of Japanese air power. Without fuel, planes could not fly. Without runways, they could not launch. Without supplies, they could not fight. The fortress was dismantling the empire one base at a time. For Japanese pilots, the frustration was immense. They had been trained to think of themselves as hunters, predators dominating the sky. But the B-17s forced them into the role of defenders, scrambling desperately in response to raids. And even when they engaged, victory was uncertain. Some succeeded in scoring hits, but more often than not, the cost was severe. A single raid might claim several zeros for only 1 or 2 damaged bombers. In the arithmetic of attrition, this was unsustainable. Japan could not afford to lose pilots at such a rate, while the Americans replaced both men and machines without hesitation. Cultural pride only deepened the pain. Japanese doctrine placed immense value on the individual pilot, the ace, whose skill and courage embodied the nation's strength. Yet against the B-17, individual valor seemed meaningless. No matter how daring a pilot was, he could not cut through the curtain of gunfire alone. It required groups, coordination and sacrifice, qualities harder to maintain as losses mounted and morale weakened. The fortress had turned their very culture against them, exposing the limits of relying on individual heroics in a war dominated by machines and industry. The fortress also struck at something the Japanese had once considered unshakable: morale. Pilots who once boasted of easy kills grew quiet after repeated encounters. They still flew with determination, but in their eyes was a shadow of doubt. Could they really stop these bombers? Could they prevent the destruction raining down on their bases? For the first time since Pearl Harbor, uncertainty gnawed at their confidence. Even the famed zero seemed less formidable when measured against the persistence of the fortress. On the ground, soldiers and civilians alike learned to fear the raids. Entire towns near airfields were shaken as bombs rained down. Supply routes were cut, transport ships were sunk, and communication lines severed. The fortress was more than a bomber. It was a wedge driving into the very heart of Japan's war machine. Each mission chipped away at the empire's ability to fight, not with one decisive strike but with a relentless barrage of smaller blows. The Japanese could not rebuild as quickly as the Americans destroyed. Perhaps most galling was the symbolism. For years, Japanese propaganda had mocked American dependence on technology, portraying them as weak and decadent. The fortress shattered that image. Here was a machine that embodied both technology and toughness, proving that American ingenuity was not fragile but formidable, and it was backed by an industrial base that dwarfed anything Japan could muster. Every raid carried a message. The Empire's early victories had awakened a giant, and that giant was now striking back with a force they could not match. Stories of fortresses returning home after incredible damage only added to the legend. One bomber came back with half its tail blown off, another with a wing shredded nearly to the spar. Crews limped into bases with engines on fire, hydraulic systems shot out, and bodies wounded, yet the planes did not fall. These stories spread among Japanese pilots, each one reinforcing the sense of invincibility. They began to view the B-17 not just as a machine but as a symbol of American willpower. To fight it was to fight inevitability itself. The transition from mockery to dread was complete. Where once Japanese pilots laughed at the flying fortress, they now cursed its name. It had humbled them in the skies, stripped them of their confidence, and crushed their bases beneath its bomb. By the time the larger B-29 superfortress took center stage later in the war, the B-17 had already done its work. It had silenced the laughter, shattered illusions of superiority, and proven that in modern warfare persistence and production outweighed bravado and pride. The power of the flying fortress was not measured solely in bombs dropped or bases destroyed. Its real strength lay in what it revealed about the nature of modern war. Japanese pilots had built their confidence on maneuverability, on the supremacy of the individual, on the myth that courage could conquer machines. But the B-17 stripped that illusion bare. It showed that machines backed by industry could grind courage into dust. The fortress did not duel with the Zero on equal terms. It refused to. Instead, it fought as a system, a network of guns, crews and formations. Against such a system, the individual pilot became small, his skill irrelevant in the face of overwhelming firepower and endless replacement. For many Japanese aviators, this realization was crushing. They had spent years in rigorous training, mastering aerobatics and gunnery, believing themselves heirs to an ancient warrior tradition. To find themselves outmatched not by skill but by factories in Detroit or assembly lines in Seattle felt humiliating. Yet every encounter reinforced the same truth. Industry mattered more than spirit. The fortress was proof that war in the 20th century would not be won in duels of aces, but in the steady, relentless work of production.
The fortress also changed the very nature of Japanese defensive operation. Before its arrival, pilots expected to fight over front lines, protecting advancing troops or escorting bombers. But the B-17 struck deep behind those lines, hitting bases far from the fighting. Suddenly nowhere was safe. The Japanese could no longer rely on distance to shield their resource. Bombers came where they pleased, when they pleased, cratering runways and destroying supplies with impunity. For the first time, Japanese airmen realized that control of the skies was slipping from their grasp. As raids intensified, commanders attempted new tactics. They tried massing fighters to overwhelm fortress formations. They experimented with coordinated attacks from above and below, yet the results were costly. Even when successful, losses among Zero squadrons were devastating. A dozen bombers destroyed might cost 20 or 30 fighters. Losses Japan could not sustain. Every engagement bled their strength further, while America's strength only grew. The fortress was not just a bomber, it was a trap that drained Japan of its most precious resource: experienced pilots. This attritional struggle exposed another weakness. Japanese planes, though nimble, were lightly built. They lacked armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, making them fragile under heavy fire. Against machine guns that spat thousands of rounds per minute, their frames disintegrated quickly. The fortress magnified this vulnerability. Its gunners, spread across every angle, ensured that attackers were rarely safe. To dive on a B-17 was to gamble your life against a wall of steel, and as more Zeros fell, fewer pilots were willing to make that gamble. On the ground, soldiers and civilians alike began to dread the fortress raids. They came with little warning, their engines announcing themselves just moments before the bombs fell. The destruction was thorough. Fuel tanks erupted into fireballs, planes were torn apart on the ground, and supply depots vanished in smoke. For those caught below, it felt as though the sky itself had turned hostile. The Japanese Empire, which once seemed unstoppable, was being reduced piece by piece, its lifelines shredded by persistent bombardment. Even among the Japanese leadership, doubts grew. Reports of increasing losses against B-17 formations, combined with the mounting destruction of vital bases, forced them to confront uncomfortable truths. Their air strategy, once so effective, was failing. They could no longer protect their own infrastructure. Worse still, they could not replace their losses quickly enough to keep pace with America's relentless production. Every destroyed fortress was a victory that lasted hours. Every lost pilot was a defeat that lasted forever. Meanwhile, American crews gained confidence. Each successful raid boosted morale, proving that the fortress could survive the fiercest defenses and still deliver its payload. Stories of bombers returning with horrific damage became rallying cries, symbols of resilience that inspired not only the crews themselves, but also the soldiers and civilians who depended on them. The myth of invincibility grew, not as propaganda but as lived experience. The more the Japanese mocked, the more reality silenced their laughter. By mid-1943, the fortress was no longer seen as an experiment. It had become an indispensable tool of the Allied war effort. While larger bombers like the B-24 and B-29 would take center stage later, the B-17 had already carved its legacy into the Pacific skies. For the Japanese, its legacy was humiliation and despair. It had shown them that their superiority was an illusion, that their bases were vulnerable, and that their pilots were not invincible. Every crater on a runway, every wrecked hangar, every burned depot was a reminder that the fortress had reshaped the war. And still the raids continued. Bases that had once laughed at the thought of a flying fortress now lay in ruins. Pilots who had once scoffed at its bulk now prayed not to face it again. The very name that had been mocked in Japanese briefings had become a curse whispered in dread. The flying fortress. The shock of the flying fortress was not limited to the battlefield. It rippled through the Japanese psyche, from commanders to the youngest recruits. For years they had believed their training, discipline, and courage made them superior to any opponent. They had been taught that Americans were soft, reliant on machines, unable to fight without overwhelming numbers. But the B-17 challenged that narrative at every turn. It proved that American machines were not fragile crutches. They were extensions of a nation's strength. The fortress did not just drop bombs, it dropped an undeniable truth. Japan's warrior spirit could not compete with America's industrial might. Pilots who had once spoken confidently of their Zero's unmatched agility began to hesitate when they spotted formations of fortress. They knew the risks. A single miscalculation meant being caught in overlapping fields of fire. Accounts from survivors often described the experience as flying into a storm traces, arcing in every direction. Air thick with bullets, engines screaming as planes tore apart. Even when they escaped, they carried the scars of those encounters, both on their machines and in their minds. The fortress had turned the sky into a gauntlet that tested not only skill but nerve. The Japanese High Command, too, was forced to adjust its perception. At first, they viewed the B-17 as a minor nuisance, a stopgap until more advanced American bombers arrived. But by 1943 they recognized it as a strategic weapon in its own right. Its raids disrupted supply chains, crippled airfields, and forced the diversion of resources desperately needed elsewhere. Every bomb that fell on a runway or depot was a blow to Japan's overstretched logistics. The fortress was not just a machine of destruction, it was a machine of disruption, eroding Japan's ability to sustain its war effort. The cultural humiliation ran deeper still. For a society that revered the concept of honor in combat, the fortress was an insult. It did not duel. It did not maneuver. It did not play by the rules of aerial chivalry. Instead, it relied on brute force, on formations, on firepower. To Japanese eyes, this seemed dishonorable at first, until they realized it was effective. Honor did not matter when your bases were in flame. Pride did not matter when your pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. The fortress forced Japan to confront the harsh reality that victory in modern war belonged not to the boldest, but to the most prepared. Even Japanese civilians began to feel its presence. Towns near military installations lived in fear of the next raid. Workers on airfields knew that every hour spent repairing a runway might be undone in minutes when the bombers returned. Children grew up with the constant rumble of engines overhead, the sight of smoke rising from distant bases. The fortress was not only a weapon against the military but against morale. It drained hope from those who once believed in Japan's invincibility. American crews, meanwhile, grew more confident with each mission. They learned how to fly tighter formations, how to coordinate defensive fire, how to survive encounters with determined Japanese interceptors. Each success reinforced the mythos of the fortress. Pilots and gunners told stories of miraculous escapes, of bombers limping home with engines aflame, of comrades saved by the interlocking fire of their squadron. These tales spread quickly, bolstering morale not just among airmen but across the Allied force. The fortress had become a symbol of resilience, as much as a weapon of war. The Japanese tried to counter this with propaganda of their own. Newspapers claimed fortresses were falling in droves. Radio broadcasts insisted that American losses were unsustainable. But these lies could not mask the truth on the ground. Bases remained in ruins, supply lines stayed broken, and the raids never stopped. The very persistence of the B-17s was proof that America could absorb losses and keep fighting. Each new raid contradicted the propaganda, and Japanese soldiers knew it. Words could not erase the craters in their runways. The longer the fortress campaign went on, the more it revealed the imbalance between the two nations. Japan's industrial base simply could not keep up. Factories strained under shortages. Shipping routes were severed by submarines and raw materials grew scarce. Meanwhile, America's production lines ran day and night, churning out not only fortresses but also the fighters, ships, and supplies needed to support them. The contrast was devastating. For every Japanese plane destroyed, another might never be built. For every American bomber destroyed, two more seemed to take its place. By 1944, the joke that had once been told in mess halls that the fortress was a flying whale waiting to be harpooned was bitter irony. The whale had not only survived, it had turned predator. Bases that once laughed at its bulk were flattened by its bombs. Pilots who once mocked its size now cursed its name, and the empire that once believed itself untouchable now lived under its shadow. The B-17 had proven not only that it could survive, but that it could dominate, and in doing so it reshaped the Pacific War. For Japanese pilots, every encounter with the flying fortress became a test of endurance. They were told to intercept the formations at all costs, but in practice these missions carried almost suicidal odds. Approaching head-on meant facing a torrent of machine gun fire from the nose. Attacking from behind meant enduring the relentless accuracy of tailgun. Diving from above meant being tracked by the top turret. while rising from below meant running into the belly guns. It was as though the fortress wore armor of bullets, each approach guarded by men determined to keep the giant alive. The B-17 was not invulnerable, and Japanese pilots did score kills, but the exchange rate was devastating. For every bomber destroyed, multiple zeros might be lost, and while the Americans replaced their crews and planes in endless numbers, every lost Japanese pilot represented months, even years of irreplaceable training. Japan's aviation program could not keep pace with the loss. The fortress was more than a bomber, it was a grinder, consuming the very lifeblood of Japan's air force. Morale began to crack. Pilots who once boasted of certain victory now spoke in whispers of dread. Some described the formations as walls of death, impossible to penetrate without terrible cost. Others began to pray before missions, not for victory but for survival. The very sight of the bombers, black silhouettes against the sky, drained their confidence. It was no longer a fight between equals, but a fight against inevitability, and inevitability is the most demoralizing enemy of all. The psychological damage extended beyond the pilots. Ground crews labored desperately to repair airfields after raids, only to see them cratered again days later. Civilians who once celebrated Japan's expansion now trembled at the sound of engines overhead. They realized that their empire, stretched across thousands of miles, was fragile under the constant hammering of American air power. The fortress embodied that hammer. It pounded bases into submission, not with a single decisive blow but with relentless repetition. The Japanese military tried to counter with innovation. They experimented with heavier anti-aircraft fire, new attack formations, and desperate kamikaze tactics. Yet the fortress still came. Its crews adapted, flying tighter formations, refining bombing accuracy, and pressing deeper into enemy territory. The Americans had discovered a rhythm of war that the Japanese could not match, a cycle of destruction and replacement that no amount of courage could disrupt. To the Americans, the B-17 became a source of pride. It was not the sleekest plane nor the most advanced, but it symbolized resilience. Stories of bombers limping home after impossible damage became legend. Crews returned with tales of engines destroyed, fuselages ripped apart, yet somehow making it back to friendly bases. These stories spread across newspapers and radio broadcasts, reinforcing the belief that the fortress was unbreakable. For Americans, it was a morale booster. For Japanese pilots, it was a nightmare that seemed to defy reason. The raids also revealed the growing imbalance in resources. Japanese factories struggled to produce enough planes, ammunition, and fuel, while American factories surged ahead at unprecedented speed. The B-17s were not just aircraft. They were symbols of this imbalance. Every formation that appeared overhead represented countless workers, engineers, and factories thousands of miles away. To Japanese eyes, it felt as though they were fighting not against planes, but against an entire nation's industrial might. And then there was the sheer persistence. The fortress did not strike once and retreat. It came again and again, flattening bases that had barely begun to recover. Pilots joked bitterly that they could set their watches by the raids, so regular were the bombings. But beneath the jokes lay despair. They could not rebuild as quickly as the Americans could destroy. Every day brought new craters, new fires, new wreckage. The laughter that once greeted the idea of flying fortress had long since turned into silence. By the time larger bombers like the B-29 entered the Pacific theater, the reputation of the B-17 was already cemented. It had proven that Japanese air superiority was not absolute, that their bases were vulnerable, and that their pilots were mortal. It had shown that courage could not outlast attrition, and that mockery could not erase reality. The fortress had done what it was built to do: flatten bases, wear down defenses, and turn the tide of war through persistence.
To the Japanese pilots who survived, it left an indelible scar. They remembered the walls of fire, the endless formations, the sound of bombs tearing apart their world. They remembered how their confidence was replaced by dread, how their laughter was silenced by reality. And above all, they remembered how the flying fortress, the plane they had once mocked, became the shadow that followed them to the very end of the war. By late 1943, the reputation of the flying fortress had spread far beyond the immediate battlefields. Japanese pilots who had once boasted of slicing through any enemy now spoke in hushed tones of the risks involved in confronting the B-17. Entire squadrons were being worn down by attrition. The proud tradition of Japanese aviation was being bled away, not by dramatic dogfights but by the relentless grind of fortress formations that refused to be silenced. Every raid was another reminder that courage could not fill the gap left by dwindling resources. At bases like Rabaul, the devastation became routine. Runways were patched only to be cratered again days later. Aircraft that managed to escape destruction on the ground often fell victim in the air. Mechanics worked night and day, cannibalizing wrecked planes for spare parts, while commanders begged for reinforcements that never came. The Americans, by contrast, seemed tireless. Their fortresses arrived in waves, each carrying tons of bombs, each escorted by a growing number of fighters. Japanese defenders realized they were not fighting equals. They were fighting an avalanche. The fortress's impact was magnified by its psychological presence. Pilots described the dread that settled in when they heard the deep drone of its engines. Even before the bombs fell, morale plummeted. They knew that destruction was inevitable, no matter how hard they fought. For men raised to believe in the supremacy of spirit, this was devastating. The fortress was not just an enemy, it was a symbol of inevitability. You could challenge it, you could even shoot one down, but you could not stop it. And the knowledge of that truth was enough to hollow out the confidence of even the bravest. The Americans exploited this effect. They flew their fortresses in tight formations, making them look even more imposing. They launched raids with precision timing, striking just when Japanese bases were struggling to recover. Each mission reinforced the image of the fortress as an unstoppable juggernaut, and because it could operate at higher altitudes than most Japanese fighters could easily reach, it seemed untouchable to those watching from the ground. To soldiers and civilians alike, the bomber was less a machine than a force of nature. Meanwhile, the Japanese fighter corps suffered irreparable losses. Their best aces, the men who had carried the Empire's hopes in the air, were being whittled away. Each loss was a blow not only to numbers but to morale. Unlike the Americans, Japan had no vast pool of trained replacements ready to step in. Every fallen pilot represented years of experience gone forever, and still the raids came. Still the bases burned. Still the fortress cast its shadow over the Pacific. The bitterness deepened as pilots began to recognize the futility of their efforts. They had mocked the fortress as a lumbering target, but now they knew the truth. It was a target protected by firepower, formations, and endless replacement. It was a target that destroyed you even as you attacked it. And worst of all, it was a target that always returned. This sense of futility drained their fighting spirit. They flew because they were ordered to, not because they believed in victory. The mockery that had once fueled their bravado had been turned against them, replaced by grim silence. On the American side, the B-17s legend grew with every mission. Crews decorated their planes with names and artwork, turning each fortress into a character of its own. Stories of bombers limping home with wings shredded or fuselages torn apart became part of Allied lore. Newspapers published photographs of battered but still flying fortresses, fueling the image of invincibility. For the home front, the B-17 symbolized resilience and revenge. For the men who faced it in the Pacific, it symbolized despair. By 1944, the fortress had accomplished what many thought impossible. It had broken the confidence of Japan's elite pilots. These men had begun the war with unshakable belief in their superiority. They ended it acknowledging, if only to themselves, that the fortress could not be stopped. The very name that once drew laughter now drew silence. The plane that was supposed to be a joke had become a legend, etched into the memories of those who fought against. When historians later measured the war, they often credited the B-29 with delivering the decisive blows to Japan, but the B-17 laid the groundwork. It was the flying fortress that showed the Japanese that their empire was vulnerable, that their airfields could be flattened, that their pilots could be outmatched not by maneuver but by persistence. It silenced their laughter and replaced it with the grim acceptance of defeat. And for the men who watched their bases burn under its bombs, that lesson was never forgotten. The transformation of the B-17 from a target of ridicule to a weapon of fear was one of the most dramatic reversals of the Pacific War. When Japanese pilots first heard of the flying fortress, they imagined a slow-moving beast that would fall easily to their nimble Zeros. They joked about it in ready rooms, laughed about it in barracks, and dismissed it as yet another example of American overconfidence. But as months turned into years, the laughter faded. By the middle of the war, the very mention of the fortress carried a weight that silenced even the most boastful. It had become the proof that mockery could not stop steel, and that pride was powerless against persistence. The B-17 excelled because it embodied a philosophy that Japan could not match. It was not built for beauty, nor for elegance. It was built for survival. Its guns covered every angle. Its armor gave crews a chance to live, and its structure was rugged enough to endure punishment that would have destroyed any Japanese aircraft. Where the Zero was fast but fragile, the Fortress was slower but unyielding. This trade-off reflected the broader contrast between the two nations. Japan had gambled on speed and daring. America invested in resilience and industry. The Fortress was the perfect representation of that choice. Its impact on Japanese bases was catastrophic. Time and again, fortresses flattened runways, demolished supply dumps, and destroyed planes on the ground. Every raid forced Japanese crews to start over, repairing what could be fixed, salvaging what could be saved. But the cycle always ended the same way, with more bombs, more craters, more wreckage. The fortress turned bases into graveyards, erasing the illusion that Japan could maintain air superiority across its sprawling empire. And then there was the psychological war. Pilots spoke of the dread that gripped them as the drone of engines grew louder. The sound meant not only danger but inevitability. They knew the bombs would fall, whether or not they managed to shoot down a few attackers. They knew that even if today's raid was beaten back, tomorrow would bring another. This erosion of confidence was as damaging as the physical destruction. It hollowed out their belief in victory, replacing it with fatalism. On the American side, the fortress became a symbol of endurance. Newspapers back home told stories of planes returning with wings shredded, engines shot out, and tails barely hanging on. These images were celebrated as proof of American toughness, but for Japanese pilots, they were terrified. If the enemy could absorb so much damage and still fight another day, how could they ever hope to win? The fortress was no longer just a machine, it was a myth made real, a flying embodiment of inevitability. By late 1943 and into 1944, the fortress had already achieved its purpose. Though newer bombers like the B-24 and B-29 would take over the role of strategic bombing, the B-17 left behind a legacy of humiliation for Japan's Air Force. It had shown that their best pilots could not halt America's advance. It had proven that their bases were vulnerable, their supply chains fragile, and their confidence misplaced. Most importantly, it had silenced the arrogance that once mocked it. For Japanese commanders, the B-17 was a constant reminder of their strategic disadvantage. They watched their forces bleed away while the Americans grew stronger. They knew their empire could not withstand such pressure indefinitely, and though they fought on with determination, the outcome was already written in the sky. The fortress had made it clear: Japan was not facing a soft enemy, but an industrial titan that would not stop until the war was won. In later years, historians would debate the true significance of the flying fortress in the Pacific. Some argued it was overshadowed by the B-29, others insisted it was most important in Europe, but for the men who fought against it in the Pacific, there was no debate. The B-17 was the machine that turned laughter into fear, arrogance into despair, and confidence into resignation. It was the bomber that flattened their bases, drained their strength, and proved that America's power could not be denied. By the time the war drew to its close, the flying fortress had already written its legend. It was not the largest, nor the most advanced, but it was the bomber that taught Japan the hardest lesson of all, that pride could not save them from bombs, and that courage could not outlast industry. The laughter that once mocked the fortress had long since died away. In its place lay silence, the silence of runways reduced to rubble, of bases burned to ash, of pilots lost forever, the silence left behind when inevitability won. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Japanese pilots looked back on their war with a mixture of pride, regret, and bitter lesson. Among the many images that haunted them, the flash of naval gunfire, the scream of dive bombers, the mushrooming explosions of torpedoes, there was one that endured above all others: the sight of the flying fortress cruising steadily overhead. To many of them, it was the machine that symbolized the moment when arrogance gave way to reality. They remembered the early days, when the B-17 was mocked as an absurd invention. Too large, too heavy, too slow,
It seemed the embodiment of American pilots joked that it would fall apart before it reached combat, that it would scatter in flames against the agility of the Zero. Yet those same pilots, months later, found themselves fighting desperately against formations that blotted out the sun, their guns spitting endless streams of fire, their bombs flattening bases that had once been thought untouchable. The fortress had turned laughter into silence, and silence into fear. What made the memory sting so deeply was not only its firepower but its persistence. The Japanese had been raised on the belief that a single man's courage could turn the tide of battle. But courage could not erase the simple fact that America had more planes, more bombs, more fuel, more men. The fortress was not feared because it was unbeatable in a duel. It was feared because duels no longer mattered. Every bomber shot down was replaced. Every raid answered with another. Every wound inflicted healed by the machinery of industry. It was this inevitability, more than the bombs themselves, that broke their spirit. In the final months of the war, Japanese bases lay in ruin. Airfields that once rang with the pride of expanding conquest were now scarred wastelands. Supply depots smoldered, hangars stood as twisted wreckage, and pilots walked among the ruins wondering how they had ever thought themselves invincible. The laughter they once aimed at the flying fortress now sounded like madness, a relic of a time when they believed illusions could shield them from steel. For American crews, the B-17 became a legend. They decorated their bombers with names and painted noses, turning them into symbols of resilience. They told stories of miraculous survival, of planes returning with wings shredded, engines blown, fuselages ripped apart, yet somehow still in the air. These stories reached newspapers and radios back home, transforming the fortress into a cultural icon of endurance. To the Japanese, the same stories were terrifying proof that their enemies' machines refused to die. When historians later wrote of the war, they often credited the B-29 with delivering the decisive blows over Japan itself. But those same historians acknowledged that it was the B-17 that had prepared the ground, breaking Japanese confidence, disrupting their bases, and proving that America could project power across the Pacific. The flying fortress had not won the war alone, but it had ensured that Japan could never win. For the men who fought against it, the memory never faded. In memoirs, interviews, and conversations long after the war, Japanese veterans spoke of the fortress with a mixture of resentment and respect. They admitted that they had underestimated it, that they had mocked it, and that in the end it had humbled them. The bitterness in their voices was not only for the bases destroyed or the pilots lost, but for the realization that they had been defeated by what they once dismissed. The flying fortress was a lesson written in steel and smoke. It showed that modern war belonged not to the swiftest hand or the bravest heart alone, but to the nation that could endure. It was the embodiment of persistence, the machine that turned arrogance into act. And in the skies of the Pacific, it became the reminder that the greatest weapon of all was not speed, not maneuver, not even courage, but the relentless capacity to keep coming back. By the war's end, the Japanese pilots no longer laughed at the fortress. They watched it soar over their shattered bases, flattening the last remnants of their defenses, and knew that their mockery had been answered. The flying fortress had proven its name, and in doing so it had written itself into their memories forever, not as the target they once ridiculed, but as the machine that silenced their sky.